Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas. I have the honor of serving as chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section, and welcome to our weekly chair chat. Today, I'm glad to have as my guest, Ms. Aliza Shatzman, who is the president and co-founder of the Legal Accountability Project. Welcome, Aliza.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the chair chat.
Glad to have you. So why don't you just start off by telling us, what is the Legal Accountability Project?
Sure. The Legal Accountability Project is a new nonprofit that basically seeks to ensure that law clerks have a positive clerkship experience and then extend support and resources to the ones who don't. I came to this advocacy work based on my personal experience with harassment and retaliation during and after my clerkship. So I really think of the nonprofit as the resource I wish existed as a WashU law student applying for a clerkship, a law clerk facing mistreatment and unsure where to go for help, and then a former clerk engaging in the formal judicial complaint process.
Well, thank you for turning what I would call your pain into action. That's very important that people learn that lesson, and that's very admirable of you. Could you share with us a bit more about your journey? You've alluded to it, but tell us about your clerkship that you referenced and what led you again to found and lead this organization.
Sure. So I went to WashU Law and realized pretty early in law school that I wanted to be a homicide prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. Did 4 different internships with DOJ to get a breadth of experience, and then decided to clerk in DC Superior Court during the 2019 to 2020 term. The messaging at my law school, like at most law schools, around clerkships was uniformly positive. This was going to be a lifelong mentor-mentee relationship. This position would confer only professional benefits. I was instructed to apply broadly and accept the first clerkship I was offered. So I did all those things. So I started clerking in August of 2019, and unfortunately, beginning just weeks into the clerkship, the judge for whom I clerked began to harass me and discriminate against me because of my gender. He would kick me out of the courtroom and tell me that I made him uncomfortable and that he just felt more comfortable with my male co-clerk. He told me I was bossy and aggressive and that I had personality issues. The day I found out that I passed the DC bar exam, so big day in my life, he called me into his chambers and told me, "You're bossy." And I know bossy because my wife is bossy. And I just remember being devastated. I mean, this was my first legal job. This judge seemed to be just singling me out for mistreatment. I wished I could be reassigned to another judge for the rest of the clerkship. My workplace did not have an employee dispute resolution or EDR plan in place that might have enabled that to happen. I confided in some attorney mentors who advised me to stick it out, and I knew that I needed a year of work experience to be eligible to apply to the USAO as a prosecutor. Tried to stick it out, things got worse, but eventually we transitioned to remote work during the pandemic, and I moved back to Philly to stay with my parents and work remotely. Judge basically ignored me for 6 weeks before he called me up one day in late April of 2020 and told me that he was ending my clerkship early because I made him uncomfortable and lacked respect for him, but he didn't want to get into it. Then he hung up on me. So reached out to DC Courts HR and they said there was nothing they could do. Law clerks have a unique relationship with judges, and they asked me whether I knew that I was an at-will employee. So then I reached out to my law school, to WashU Law, for support and assistance. And I found out that this judge had a history of mistreating his clerks, and that law school officials, including several professors and the clerkships director, knew about this at the time I'd accepted the clerkship. Decided not to share that information with me because they wanted another WashU Law student to clerk. So after all this, it took me about a year to get back on my feet. But I eventually secured my dream job in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, and I moved back to DC in the summer of 2021, hoping to put this behind me and launch my career as prosecutor. And I was 2 weeks into training. I'd already started working there when I received some pretty devastating news that definitely altered the course of my life. I was told the judge had made negative statements about me during my background investigation, that I wouldn't be able to obtain a security clearance, and that my job offer was being revoked. A couple days later, USAO offered me the opportunity to interview for another job, and they revoked that offer too, based on the judge's same negative reference. At this point, I was only 2 years into my legal career. This judge just seemed to have enormous power to ruin my life. So I filed a judicial complaint, hired attorneys in the summer and fall of 2021, participated in the investigation into the now former judge. And we were partway through that when I found out the judge was on administrative leave pending investigation into other misconduct at the time he'd filed the negative reference about me. But the U.S. Attorney's Office really wasn't alerted of those circumstances until January 2022, when the former judge, pursuant to the terms of our private settlement agreement, separate from anything the judiciary could or would do for a law clerk, he issued a clarifying statement addressing some but not all of his outrageous claims about me. But by then the damage had been done. It had been too long, and I was pretty much blackballed from what I thought was my dream job. And during that summer, I became aware of proposed legislation called the Judiciary Accountability Act, or JAA, that would extend Title VII protections to judiciary employees, including law clerks. Currently, folks like me are exempt from Title VII. We cannot sue our harassers for harms done to our lives. Stayed in touch with House and Senate offices about that legislation. And when a House Judiciary hearing happened in March 2022, I submitted written testimony sharing a condensed version of the story I've just shared with you about my experience and advocating for the legislation, and an amendment to cover the DC courts. In the weeks following that, the response was very positive, and I appreciated that. And so I began tossing around some ideas to further my advocacy work, which eventually led me to launch the nonprofit in June to address various deficiencies in the clerkship application process that I personally experienced, as well as a larger lack of accountability in the judiciary.
Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for sharing it in great detail for our listening audience. Tell me this, does your nonprofit help law students in the application process, or once they secure a clerkship, do you provide assistance there? What role do you actually play in trying to make sure no one else goes through what you went through?
Sure, it's definitely both and, to answer your question. So probably easiest for me to explain what the nonprofit does. The nonprofit is working on a couple initiatives in collaboration with law schools beginning this year, premised on this idea. I speak with a lot of law students and I say, so you want to clerk? Great. How would you avoid judges who harass their clerks? Some students would say, I'd ask someone. Who are you going to ask? Some clerkship directors tell students to, quote, do their research. What research are you going to do when so little information is available about judges on an equitable basis?
Right.
A handful of law schools conduct a post-clerkship survey of their alumni. Some, but not all, keep that in a searchable database accessible to students considering a clerkship. Law schools understand that these do not capture the scope of the problem. Law clerks who face mistreatment are historically unwilling to report that back to their law schools. They fear reputational harm in the legal community, retaliation by the judges who mistreated them, and an inability to, following that, secure their next jobs. Law schools are also asking the wrong questions. They are not seeking to elucidate information about mistreatment. They're seeking to help funnel more students into clerkships. We are trying to address that problem. We have created a centralized clerkships reporting database, which will democratize information about judges, ensuring that as many law students considering a clerkship as possible have as much info about as many judges as possible before they make what is clearly a really important decision about their careers, especially considering the outsized impact that a judicial clerkship has on one's future career success. Law schools partnering with us will send an email to their law clerk alumni the past 10 to 20 years worth, prompting them to create an account with the Legal Accountability Project. Law clerk alumni will then fill out our post-clerkship survey, which asks a variety of information you'd want to know about before clerking. Mistreatment is definitely something we seek to capture. We want to highlight both positive experiences and negative ones like mine. But there's other stuff you'd want to know about your boss and your job before starting it, stuff you would get to know if you were seeking other private or public sector employment. How does the judge provide feedback? Do I get writing and courtroom experience? How many co-clerks will I have? Can I take vacation? What are my hours? All kinds of stuff you might want to know. Law clerks write a report about their clerkship. They can report anonymously if they so choose. I believe that many clerks who face mistreatment will choose to report anonymously. In exchange, it's a subscription model. Law schools will pay $5 per student per year based on their total JD enrollment. And then their students get access to reading the reports. But importantly, and why this is so much better than what exists at a handful of law schools right now, they don't just read their alumni's reports. They read the reports of all the alums at all the schools participating in the database. Based on my experience interfacing with more than 70 law schools worth of deans and clerkship directors, speaking with numerous students and current and former clerks, and my personal experience, I am confident this is the best way to ensure positive clerkship experiences on the front end, to empower more diverse students to pursue a clerkship, and to protect the next generation of attorneys against mistreatment.
So at this point, how many law schools have partnered with your organization?
So we're still working to identify our initial slate of law school partners. I think I might have overshot the timelines for these items in terms of identifying our law school partners. So what I did throughout the fall is I visited 23 law school campuses, did 18 events in person, 5 via Zoom, sharing my story, talking about the scope of the problem, talking about solutions, including our resources. And at the vast majority of those visits, deans and clerkship directors attended our events, saw the enormously positive student response, met with me afterwards to talk about the work I'm doing. And so I'm very optimistic about announcing our initial law school partners later this winter. I think reasonably probably 10 to 20 schools will partner with us the first year, and we will supplement law school's existing resources. But I think 2 to 3 years down the road, all 100 plus law schools will partner with us, will supplant existing resources, and this database will be the go-to resource for students and young alumni considering a clerkship or a judicial externship.
And in your research and in your collaboration, have you found that your experience is more common than you realize with other law clerks, judicial clerks?
So I tend to characterize my experience as not rare, but rarely shared publicly. And that's why it's so important whenever I speak, interviews, podcasts, events, when I write about this, and I write about it a lot, I share my experience to let other clerks know that they are not alone. I believe that these issues, gender discrimination, harassment, retaliation, bullying, are pervasive and unaddressed in both the state and federal courts. There's really a dearth of data in this space. Federal judiciary until recently has been notoriously unwilling to conduct any sort of workplace culture assessment to assess the scope of these problems. I suspected I was not alone, but it's just been amazing the number of current and former clerks reaching out to confide in me, share their experience for the first time, thank me. And it's amazing to have those conversations via Zoom with current and former clerks and see them feeling more empowered as they share their stories for the first time. But I think it's so important to underscore that this is a pervasive problem. Just like harassment is pervasive in many industries, and it is in the legal community. I know federal judiciary leadership doesn't love to hear words like pervasive, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem.
Have you found evidence of harassment, not just in gender, but also perhaps in race or sexual orientation or gender identity, religion as well?
All of the above, absolutely, yes. And I really think of the database as empowering historically marginalized groups to clerk, encouraging more diverse candidates to pursue judicial clerkships, very much in line with Judge Fogel and Justice Liu's new article about law clerk appellate hiring. It is historically marginalized groups, anecdotally, who face the brunt of mistreatment during these clerkships. And I know because they reach out to me often that they choose not to clerk or apply less broadly because they simply don't have the information they need before applying. They would clerk if they had this information. If information about judges were just transparently available to everybody on an equitable basis. So when I speak with law schools, I say, no school has a monopoly on info about judges. Every school has a ceiling on the number they can keep track of. It totally depends on who your alums have clerked for in the past. And this database and increasing transparency in the judiciary is going to bolster diversity, bolster everybody's clerkship program.
So to what extent have you been able to find any partnership, if any, with the judiciary, with the judicial organizations on state, also through the sub-circuits and nationally?
Great question. A couple deans and clerkship directors have asked me to look into this more. So this is something I think through a lot. I spend a lot of time speaking with individual judges, and increasingly I'm reaching out to circuits and chief judges to have these conversations. I've learned a couple things. Overall, judges are overwhelmingly supportive of this. They believe that transparency benefits prospective clerks and judges, helping everybody identify a positive work environment. They know that positive reviews in the database will bolster not only their reputations, but their clerkship applicant pools. Judges reach out to me often to ask me when the database is going to go live so their current and former clerks can report into it. They also know that this type of database post-clerkship survey exists already at a handful of law schools, primarily but not exclusively in the T14. So judges have been overwhelmingly supportive. Many of them have reached out to their alma maters or to other schools from which they hire to convey their support, that they believe their schools should partner with the Legal Accountability Project. I have thought through a formal partnership with the judiciary. I think that would be quite challenging. I am open to the dialogue. I speak with judges a lot, still trying to get in touch with more. I think it would be challenging, but open to thinking it through. I want to make sure that the database is perceived as something that protects and empowers law students, prospective clerks. I want to work with the judiciary whenever possible, but I'm certainly not waiting on them.
As you well know, there's been an attack on the integrity of the judiciary for the last few years in our public space, in our political dialogue. And I would think that judges would want to make sure that there's no attack on their integrity in the context of their actual work environment. So I would love to see, like you said, all judges embrace this type of project, because the last thing we want is to live in a society where, judges have the reputation of, violating the law themselves.
Yes.
That really would undermine our third branch of government. So let me ask you this, as I shared with you prior to our live chat, this year, the theme of our section is economic justice. And we're trying to highlight and talk about the economic justice issues in the broader context of our civil rights and social justice conversations. In your work, what have you seen as the economic issues that are impacted by the work you're doing, generally, but also if you could share even how it impacted you?
Sure. So I see these issues as all interconnected and larger pipeline issues. One of the historically marginalized groups who choose not to clerk or face the brunt of mistreatment during clerkships are first-gen folks or lower income students who really need to think about the implications of their career moves. Those folks are also, they have less information throughout the application process because perhaps they don't have family members who are attorneys to guide them. They come in perhaps a step behind two law schools. They're also probably a little bit more pressured to accept that first clerkship they're offered, even if something feels wrong to them. Or they might lack the appropriate mentors to steer them away from a judge who might be a bad fit. I really think of the database as equalizing, democratizing information about judges for everybody, regardless of income level, encouraging everybody to realize their full potential. And it's also related to diversifying the clerkship applicant pool and the judiciary. And one diversity issue is economic diversity. The vast majority of law clerks are white and male. The vast majority of judges are white and male. And these issues are all connected. If we want a socioeconomically diverse clerkship applicant pool and judiciary, we need to make the information available to everybody, not gatekeep it and only make it accessible to certain groups. So I appreciate the question. This is something I think through a lot.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, this conversation is so important, because what you're really highlighting is, you know, young law students, young lawyers at the beginning of their career, getting that first step, getting that foundational place where they can build on their career. And basically what you're telling us is that it was taken away from you in a real sense. And so I can see how this could impact law students and young lawyers who are, like you said, first generation, first lawyer in the family. Families' hopes and dreams have been poured into these people. And then for something like this to happen to them can be devastating. So thank you for all that you're doing in this regard. Where can people find out more about your work? What is your website? Are you on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram? How do people find you?
People can visit legalaccountabilityproject.org. That's our website to join our mailing list, learn more about us, support us. I am on Twitter at Aliza Shatzman, pretty active on social media, LinkedIn, I have a Facebook. Folks should reach out to me to learn more. For anybody galvanized after hearing me talk about this, reach out to your law school and encourage them to partner with the Legal Accountability Project. This is the best way to ensure positive clerkship experiences, to ensure that everybody can bring their full selves to work, and that my clerkship experience is nobody else's clerkship experience.
Aliza Shatzman, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you for your contribution to our profession. And I know that your contribution will continue to grow and be impactful for years to come. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful afternoon.